Madam President, I come to the floor today to talk about the debt crisis facing this country and the opportunity we have to address this issue in a way that balances the budget and ensures the long-term fiscal solvency for future generations. The recent fiscal cliff agreement, which enacted tax relief for 99% of Americans, addressed the revenue side of the equation. But as everyone knows, revenue increases alone are not going to solve the debt crisis. In fact, the revenues, the tax increases that went in effect as a part of the fiscal cliff deal generate enough revenue over the next 10 years, and I should say if you annualize that over the next year, to fund the government for less than a week next year. So all the talk about, the higher revenues and what that will do to address our long-term fiscal solvency, what it will do to address the deficit, if you think about it in those terms, it really puts into perspective what the real problem is. Because a lot of people, we have a debate in this city and here in the Congress all the time about whether or not we can address the huge debt that we have in front of us, the trillion-dollar annual deficits, by raising taxes on the so-called rich and people in the higher income categories. Well, that was done. That was done as part of the fiscal cliff negotiations that occurred. Now, remember, those taxes were all scheduled to go up. They were scheduled to go up on anybody who had an income tax liability on January 1st, and because of the agreement that was reached, we were able to protect 99, and in my case in South Dakota, more than 99% of taxpayers from those tax increases. But that being said, there are those in the higher income categories and some businesses who will see higher taxes as a result of that. But those higher taxes represent enough revenue next year to fund the federal government for less than a week. So the question, Madam President, before the House is what do we do for the other 358 days of the year? Well, that's where we have to start talking about the real problem, what really affects and afflicts Washington and our fiscal situation for the foreseeable future and for the long-term future, and that's government spending. The reality is that the federal government doesn't tax too little, it spends too much. And over the past 4 years, that deficit has exceeded $1 trillion each year. And the long-term outlook is even worse. This country faces unsustainable fiscal imbalances largely because of entitlement programs such as Social Security and Medicare that have not been reformed in a way that aligns our current demographics with the needs of these programs, which must be done if we're going to save and protect these programs for future generations. Entitlement spending is the largest driver. It's the largest driver of our national debt over the long term. While it's true that federal revenue as a percentage of GDP has declined over the past few years, this was true because of the Great Recession, not because tax rates were too low. The average ratio of federal revenue to GDP over the past 40 years has been roughly in the 18% range. And based on Congressional Budget Office data, it's expected that federal revenues will exceed their historical averages within the next 10 years and remain there for the foreseeable future, even without additional tax increases. And I want to illustrate that by this chart, which I think it tells the story. They always talk about a picture, telling in exchange for 1,000 words. Well, I can talk a lot about this, but I think this visually illustrates it perhaps as well as anything. If you look at the green part here, that represents federal revenue historically, and this goes back to 1980. If you took this chart back to literally back to the 1970, late 1960s, you'd find, I think, that over that time period, the revenues stay pretty static. They go up and down a little bit based on what's happening in the economy. And of course, we had the downturn here in the 2007-2008 timeframe. But revenues are starting to climb back up to that historical average. So it's about, give or take, 18% of GDP. That's what historical revenues are. Now, the black strip, which perhaps is hard to see, is what was enacted in the fiscal cliff negotiation. Those are enacted tax increases that will add a little bit to that as you project out. This chart takes you out literally to 2040. The purple here represents the additional taxes the president would like to get. If the president got everything he got, or everything he wanted in the form of taxes, the revenue picture would be about right here. And this takes you from where we are today out to about 2040. Well, as you can see, Even if you got all the tax increases, the president got all the tax increases that he wanted, this represents this line right here, it still doesn't come anywhere close to dealing with the spending that is going to explode in the out years if we don't do something to rein that in by reforming many of these programs that I just mentioned. If we're going to save and protect Social Security and Medicare for future generations, we have to reform those programs in a way that doesn't create this huge red line that spikes into the future and literally bankrupts the country. In fact, Social Security ran a cash deficit in 2010. Medicare, we're told by the actuaries, will be insolvent by the year 2024. And in fact, in the hospital portion of the Medicare Trust Fund, we're told may be insolvent by the year 2016. So these are important dates to remember, because those are the dates at which the revenue coming in from the payroll taxes that support Social Security and Medicare no longer pay for the benefits that are paid out to beneficiaries. And so, you know, we've got this sort of train wreck coming. We know that what drives federal spending are these entitlement programs. It's about, what we call mandatory spending in the federal budget, it's about 60% now of all federal spending, largely composed of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So we have this crisis looming. We see this way this thing just starts exploding here in the out years because of the demographics of the country. We've got more people who are baby boomers that are reaching retirement age. People are living longer, all good things. But we have to align those programs with the demographics of this country, and today they are not. Today we are headed on a path that will take us toward a fiscal train wreck unless we do something about that. And I think it's important to point out that the reason that we are where we are, the reason we're running nearly $1 trillion deficit or north of $1 trillion deficits every single year for the past 4 years is because spending has increased dramatically over that time frame. And again, just to put that into perspective, before the Great Recession in 2007, the federal government was generating about $2.5 trillion annually in tax revenue. Well, at that time, the government was spending about $2.7 trillion each year, and so you had somewhere on the order of a couple $100 billion in annual deficits. Well, as I said, revenues dropped off a little bit from that period, 2008, in the financial meltdown, but those have started to pop back up to a more historic and traditional level. So now revenues are back up to roughly that $2.5 trillion annual range. What has changed over that same period of time between 2007 and 2012 is the amount that the federal government spends annually. I just mentioned that in 2007, the federal government spent $2.7 trillion, okay? Well, we're now at the end of 2012, fiscal year 2012, which ended on September 30th of this year. The federal government spent $3.5 trillion. So you saw almost $1 trillion increase in spending over that 5-year period at a time when revenues have stayed somewhat static, although they dipped in the recession, but now they've come back, as I said, to that more historic level. So essentially what is driving these deficits is the massive run-up in spending. Well, what caused that? Well, you had a stimulus program that was going to be one-time spending, much of which I think has gotten factored into the baseline. Eventually you're going to have, with the new health care mandates, enormous amounts of new spending associated with that, which I think is going to make this picture much worse than it looks already today. But my point, very simply, Madam President, is that we have a fiscal crisis in this country which needs to be addressed. And we have been kicking that can down the road for way too long. Well, we have run out of the road. And, you know, the Congressional Budget Office has made it abundantly clear as in each of their assessments of our fiscal situation as a country, most recently in November of 2012, a couple of months ago, they came out and said the following, and I quote, "With the population aging and health care costs per person likely to keep growing faster than the economy, the United States cannot sustain the federal spending programs that are now in place," end quote. That's from the CBO. I mean, they track this stuff on a daily basis for us. And so we have a real challenge ahead of us. We have a major problem. And I would argue, Madam President, again, that this is predominantly a spending problem. And that, I think, is illustrated again by this chart. If you look at government revenues, it's a fairly flat line. It's been a fairly, with the ups and downs in the economy, going back, way back, averages about 18% of revenue. It actually, without any changes in the baseline, I think ends up at about 18.6% of revenue a decade from now. But what you see here is spending, which historically has been in the 20 to 20% range. If you go back over the past 40 years, it's just going to explode. The spike that you see right here is why we have a fiscal crisis on our hands and why it is so important that we act to rein in out of control federal spending. And so, Madam President, I would suggest to my colleagues here in the Senate, as I have for a long time, that where this really starts, it starts with passing a budget. And you have to go back a long time now. I mentioned this the other day, but the last time the United States Senate passed a budget, the iPad didn't even exist. I mean, most of us now take iPads for granted. Many Americans, not all, but some, at least Americans, have iPads. Well, they came on the scene about April of 2010. There hasn't been a budget passed in the United States Senate since April of 2009. So we are going on 4 years and now 1,360 some days since the last time the United States Senate acted on a budget. That is irresponsible. It is especially irresponsible in light of this problem. We have a responsibility to the taxpayers of this country as stewards of their tax dollars to do what we can to make sure that we are putting the fiscal house of this country in order in a way that will ensure that future generations of Americans have at least as good as, if not better, standard of living and quality of life than what the generation that came before has had. That's not going to happen because we are piling on the backs of future generations enormous amounts of debt. In fact, the $16.4 trillion in debt that the nation has today, if you break that down on an individual basis, that's about $53,000 for every man, woman, and child in America. That's what every individual owes. Every individual in this country owes of that $16.4 trillion in debt. That is not fair to future generations. And it is up to us as leaders to look at these things and make decisions today that are in the best interests of future generations. It's been sort of I think a tradition in this country, a heritage, if you will, for one generation of Americans to sacrifice so that the future generation, the next generation of Americans can have a better life, a better standard of living, a better quality of life. That's certainly something that's true where I come from in South Dakota and where the chair comes from in North Dakota. We represent people who understand that you sacrifice so that the next generation, those that come after you, have a better life than you had. Well, if we don't change the way that we're doing things, this next generation will be the first generation of Americans where that's not true, where literally they will have a lower standard of living and a lower quality of life than what we've experienced because we weren't willing to live within our means. We continued to spend money we didn't have. We continued to borrow money from China and hand the bill to future generations. It's unconscionable, Madam President, given this picture, and again, picture speaks 1,000 words, that we haven't done a budget in the Senate for the last 4 years. And there's always a blame game that's played here in Washington, D.C., and I understand that both sides have contributed over the years. When my party was in charge of the Congress, we spent too much. Obviously, since that time, since we've been out of the majority here in the Congress, the numbers have increased dramatically. And if you look at the amount of debt that we've piled up just in the last 4 years under the current administration, it's about $6 trillion that we've added to the debt in that amount of time. So the spending is exploding. The tax revenues are staying fairly steady over time, as I pointed out with this particular graphic here. But the one thing that we know for certain, and that is that raising taxes doesn't solve the problem. If the President got everything that he wanted in terms of additional tax increases, and that would be this purple line right here, it doesn't come anywhere close to addressing the amount of spending that we've already put on the books and that we're going to have to borrow to pay for and hand that bill to future generations. Well, you can only do that for so long. It is high time that the United States Senate got on board and started doing a budget. I served on the Budget Committee for the last 2 years. I hoped that being on the Budget Committee would be a place where a lot of big debates would occur about how to deal with these big fiscal issues that are facing our country. It turned out to be wrong. We didn't do a budget. We didn't mark one up. We didn't put one on the floor. We didn't vote. We didn't have amendments. We didn't do anything to address this fiscal crisis. And to be fair, the House of Representatives every single year on time has passed a budget. The President of the United States, who needs to be a party to this, he's the only one of 307 million Americans who can sign a bill into law, can engage the American public and the Congress in a way that would address this. The budgets that he's submitted to the Congress, when they've been voted on here in the Senate and the House, haven't received a single vote. Not a single vote. Either Republican or Democrat in the House or the Senate has voted for the budgets that the President has submitted. Why? Because they're not serious. The President hasn't taken this issue seriously. And neither has the majority here in the United States Senate, where we haven't had a budget now for 4 consecutive years. So it is high time that changed. I hope that it will. I'm encouraged, actually, by what I've been hearing from some of my colleagues about this year, perhaps now, finally, after 4 years, actually doing a budget, putting a plan in place for how we're going to address this fiscal crisis, this amount of spending that is going to bankrupt the country unless we take steps to avert it. And so there are lots of ideas out there, Madam President. And, you know, it's not like we don't know what the issues are, we don't know what the problems are. We do. There have been many bipartisan commissions that have studied this, that have examined it thoroughly, have all come to the same conclusion with regard to what the various problems are, and frankly, for that matter, what the solutions are. And my colleague, Senator Hatch, was down here earlier this morning talking about some of those suggestions, many of which, as I said, have come from bipartisan commissions. But we know that if we do nothing, we are going to bankrupt the country and ensure that the programs that many Americans today rely upon are not going to be available to future generations of Americans. So I would hope that this is the year in which we do a budget. This is the year in which the President engages in this discussion in a meaningful way that allows us to put in place a path that will avert what is going to be a major crisis. But the problem, Madam President, is not that we tax too little, it's that we spend too much. Madam President, I yield the floor.